Hello, let's start the second lecture. In this lecture, you will learn how to manage your AI infrastructure. In order to learn or utilize AI technology in the future, you must first learn how to build an environment where you can develop and study AI. This is because modern deep learning technology requires a variety of hardware and software. But why should we use deep learning? Recently, deep learning techniques are widely used in many AI fields. So if you want to learn about AI, it is better to have a good understanding of deep learning first. Deep learning models usually operate on a large amount of matrix operations. However, the CPU installed in computers is not optimized to perform matrix operations. Therefore, in order to utilize deep learning technology, a device that performs these calculations is required, and that is the role of the GPU. There is a lot of matrix computation hardware units inside the GPU, so you can perform matrix operations quickly. For this reason, many AI researchers and engineers are using GPUs to implement deep learning models. In order to take advantage of deep learning technology, the computer must be equipped with an appropriate GPU device. We recommend installing a GPU with at least 11 GB of VRAM. We're not affiliated with NVIDIA, but the most recent deep learning technologies are implemented using NVIDIA's CUDA programming library. Therefore, in order to study or utilize deep learning technology, you have no choice but to purchase a GPU device from NVIDIA that supports CUDA. However, we recommend that you purchase GeForce 30 series graphic card, not graphics cards for rendering like NVIDIA Quadro. Modern deep learning models are very large in volume. Therefore, a large amount of VRAM is required to load such a large model into a GPU device. In addition, a large amount of VRAM sometimes reduces training time for deep learning models, which will be discussed later in this course. In the previous slide, we explained why we use NVIDIA GPU devices. NVIDIA has been developing its own GPU programming library, CUDA, even before deep learning technology became popular. This library is only supported on NVIDIA GPU devices, and with the development of deep learning technology, it has become the most popular GPU programming library used by the AI researchers. AMD has recently released ROCm, a GPU programming library similar to CUDA, as an open source, but there aren't many users yet. CUDA is a programming interface that allows programmers to manipulate NVIDIA GPU devices. So should people learn CUDA programming? You don't have to. Deep learning frameworks are written in CUDA, but most programmers do not need to modify the source code of deep learning frameworks. Instead, you can use the libraries of deep learning frameworks based on CUDA. However, in order to run the deep learning framework, you need to install the CUDA toolkit and NVIDIA graphics driver. A deep learning framework is a programming interface that allows developers to develop deep learning models. The deep learning framework implements various building blocks used in deep learning models based on CUDA and then provides them in the form of a library. Thanks to this, general AI developers can use the deep learning frameworks to design deep learning models without having to do CUDA programming. The most widely used deep learning frameworks are TensorFlow and PyTorch. Both frameworks provide interfaces implemented in the Python language. In conclusion, you only need to know how to use the Python programming language to implement deep learning models. Now, let's prepare the development environment to study deep learning technology. First of all, you need to install Ubuntu Desktop. In order to take this course, you must have Ubuntu or another Linux installed. Of course, this course is based on Ubuntu Desktop version 20 LTS. Ubuntu must be installed directly on your computer, not on a virtual machine. For instructions on how to download and install the Ubuntu OS image, please check the provided link. If you do not have a GPU device on your desktop, you may consider using a cloud service, but it may be costly and could limit your use. Therefore, we recommend you to use a computer with a GPU device installed. Now, let's learn how to install NVIDIA graphics drivers. By pressing Ctrl-Alt F3 on the lock screen, we can enter the special Ubuntu console. You do not need to know this in detail, and those who have set up automatic login can log out and enter this console. Enter the following 4 lines of commands, line by line, to install the NVIDIA graphics driver. Then type sudo apt install NVIDIA driver, then press Tab key instead of Enter key. Then you will see several versions of the drivers at the bottom. Check the driver version of the highest version among them, and write the package on the console and press Enter. This will install a latest compatible graphics driver for your GPU device. Finally, to finish installing the NVIDIA graphics driver, type sudo reboot now in the terminal. The computer will then restart and the driver installation will be completed. Congratulations! Now you have installed the NVIDIA graphics driver. Open the terminal to check if the driver is installed properly. If you enter the command NVIDIA SIMI in the command line, you will see something like the following picture. From now on, I will show you how to set up the practice environment that we will use in the future. First, let's install Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a free and open source code editor that provides a variety of tools for software development. There are many code editors besides Visual Studio Code, but we will use Visual Studio Code in this course. Some people use special text editors instead of code editors, but generally developers use code editors. The download link and installation method for VS Code can be found on the course website. If you are already familiar with code editors, you can use any other code editor you want. Sometimes we need to use not only the code editor, but also a text editor available in the terminal called Vim. Besides Vim, popular text editors include Emacs and Nano. Text editors are mainly used in environments where a graphical interface is not provided. Those who want to practice and study using GPU Cloud may need to utilize these text editors. This course is conducted using Visual Studio Code in the GUI environment of Ubuntu Desktop. But for those who want to know, here is how to install Vim. After opening the terminal, enter the commands on the screen in order to install Vim. You can check how to use Vim in the following link. GPU Cloud users will probably need a variety of software as well as a development environment like Vim. The remainder of today's lecture is intended for these users. Students who do not use GPU Cloud can skip to the next lecture or stop watching. In this part, I will explain how Windows users without GPU devices can utilize GPU Cloud. Of course, there is no need to worry because the programs we will introduce are supported in other OSs such as Mac OS as well. An SSH client is a program used to connect to a terminal, a remote server, or a computer. Using this program, we can use any terminal on another computer. In order to connect to any remote server or computer with an SSH client, an SSH server must be installed on the remote computer. However, in most cloud servers such as AWS, SSH server is already installed. A widely used SSH client for Windows OS is PuTTY. PuTTY can be downloaded and installed from the following link. You can use the installer to install it, or you can download the portable version and run it right away. When you launch PuTTY, you will see a screen similar to the one in the slide. First, set lines of scrollback to 5000 in the window category. Then, set the value of remote character set to UTF-8 as shown in the second picture. Now, we will show you how to connect to a remote server. After clicking the session category, enter the domain or IP address of the server you want to connect to in the hostname or IP address field. Set a desired name in Save Sessions and click the Save button to save your setting. And if you click the Open button, you can log in and access the remote server. A more detailed description of how to use PuTTY for AWS Cloud can be found at the following link. Users of other types of clouds or computers can learn how to use SSH client by looking up in the search engine. Next, we will explain how to access a remote GPU cloud for Ubuntu desktop users who don't have a GPU device on their computer. Open a terminal and enter the following 3 commands in order. Then, you can install the SSH client on your computer. Linux users such as Ubuntu can connect to a remote server using a terminal after installing OpenSSH client, even if they do not use an SSH client such as PuTTY. If you want to connect to a remote server after OpenSSH client is installed, you can log in and connect to the server by entering SSH username as server IP or SSH server domain as shown in the bottom of the slide. If you want to know how to use SSH, please check the link below. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol and is a communication protocol used to send computer files from one computer to another. Simply put, an FTP client is a program that can be used to send and receive files to and from a remote server. For FTP, you can use an encryption method called SSH. This encryption method is the encryption method used by the SSH client we saw earlier. A well-known FTP client is FileZilla. FileZilla can be downloaded and installed from the following link. How to use FileZilla is described on the FileZilla homepage, and the method to connect to a remote server is same as SSH. Enter the remote server account information, IP address or domain address, and port number 22 and try to connect. Once the connection is established, you can access the remote server's file system with an FTP client. This guide is for other OS users. As I said before, we will use an Ubuntu environment in our lectures. If you need to use Windows or other OS, you can find and install the programs introduced today by yourself. Install the NVIDIA graphics driver and install the code editor. If you're using a Mac or Linux GPU client, install FileZilla and SSH client. We explained CUDA, but we did not explain how to install CUDA. You will learn how to easily install CUDA later. And even if you do not install CUDA, there is no problem in watching the next lecture. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python library and shell scripting. If you're already familiar with shell scripting in Python, you can skip the next lecture. Thank you.